It looked like a normal, quiet day on campus. The air was crisp, with a gentle breeze carrying the faint scent of freshly mowed grass. Students strolled along the cobblestone paths, their laughter and chatter filling the space between towering oak trees. Some clutched steaming cups of coffee, others hurriedly flipped through notes or tapped away on their phones. The atmosphere was alive with the energy of learning, the promise of discovery. Amid the hustle and bustle, one figure stood out, though not in a way most would notice. Dr. James Harrington walked briskly toward the lecture hall, a stack of neatly arranged papers cradled in one arm and a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His appearance was unassuming salt and pepper hair, a tweed jacket that had seen better days, and a warm, if slightly tired, smile. To the students passing by, he was just another professor, someone to nod at politely before moving on with their day. But James Harrington was far from ordinary. Beneath the modest exterior lay a man whose contributions to science had shaped the world in ways most couldn't imagine. He had spent decades solving problems that had stumped even the brightest minds. His research had broken barriers, earning him the highest honor any scientist could dream of, a Nobel Prize. Yet, he chose to keep his achievements private, preferring the quiet satisfaction of teaching and mentoring over the spotlight of fame. Today, as he approached the lecture hall, James was thinking about his students. He had just finished grading a particularly challenging set of papers, and he was impressed by the creativity some had shown. Teaching was his passion, a way to pass on the knowledge he had spent years acquiring. But little did he know, this seemingly ordinary day would be anything but typical. James pushed open the heavy wooden door of the lecture hall and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of chalk and aged wood, and the sunlight streaming through the tall windows gave it a warm, golden glow. He greeted a few early arrivals with a nod and began setting up for his lecture. As he wrote equations on the chalkboard, his mind wandered to the topic of the day, the delicate interplay between theoretical physics and practical application. Outside, the campus continued its routine. The quad was alive with activity, students debating politics, others engrossed in their books, and a group tossing a frisbee near the fountain. No one paid much attention to the police car that pulled up near the administration building. A uniformed officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the area. Officer Daniels was not a regular presence on campus, and his arrival immediately caught the attention of a few students. Known for his brusque demeanor and quick judgments, he had a reputation for being a bit heavy-handed. Today, he was responding to a vague complaint about a suspicious individual wandering the grounds. With little more to go on, Daniels began his patrol, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Meanwhile, James was deep into his lecture. He moved back and forth across the room, his voice animated as he explained complex concepts in simple terms. The students were captivated, not just by the subject but by the passion with which he spoke. For James, teaching wasn't just about transferring knowledge, it was about inspiring curiosity, encouraging his students to think beyond the obvious. As the lecture ended and students began filing out, James gathered his materials, unaware of the commotion brewing just outside the building. Officer Daniels, still patrolling the campus, had stopped to question a group of students. His presence was beginning to draw attention, and murmurs spread through the crowd. James stepped outside, the late morning sun warming his face. He adjusted his satchel and began walking toward his next class. As he passed the fountain, he noticed a small group gathered near the administration building, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Unbeknownst to him, Daniels had zeroed in on his figure. To the officer, James fit the vague description he had been given: a man carrying a bag, moving around the campus with what appeared to be a purpose. Daniels began walking briskly toward him, his hand resting on the radio clip to his shoulder. James noticed the officer approaching but thought little of it. Perhaps Daniels was lost or needed directions. It wasn't uncommon for visitors to the campus to ask for help navigating its labyrinth of buildings. When Daniels called out, James stopped and turned, his polite smile unwavering. "Excuse me, sir," Daniels said, his tone sharp. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" James raised an eyebrow, puzzled by the question. "I'm heading to my next class," he replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" Daniels looked him over, his eyes narrowing. "We've had reports of someone acting suspiciously around here. You fit the description." James chuckled softly, not out of disrespect but out of disbelief. "Suspicious? I'm a professor here. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." But Daniels wasn't convinced. To him, James's calm demeanor was almost too calm, and the worn satchel looked just a little too out of place. "I'll need to see some ID," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Students whispered to one another, some pulling out their phones to record the interaction. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his faculty ID, handing it to the officer without complaint. Daniels studied the card, his expression unreadable. He handed it back but didn't step away. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. James hesitated, not because he had anything to hide but because the question felt intrusive. "Papers," he said simply. "Assignments from my students. Mind if I take a look?" Daniels pressed. James sighed, the weight of the situation beginning to settle over him. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the murmurs growing louder. Reluctantly, he opened the satchel, revealing neatly stacked papers and a few textbooks. Daniels peered inside, his expression unchanging. "All right," he said finally, stepping back. But as James began to close the bag, something caught the light, a small, golden medal tucked into a side pocket. The crowd gasped, and even Daniels seemed momentarily taken aback. James froze, realizing what had happened. The medal, his most prized possession, had slipped partially into view. It was unmistakable, the intricate design, the gleaming surface. A student near the front of the crowd whispered, "Is that a Nobel Prize?" James straightened, his expression unreadable. The whispers grew louder, the realization spreading like wildfire. And in that moment, the quiet, unassuming professor standing before them was no longer just a face in the crowd. He was something much, much more. Here's the continuation of the opening hook and setup, building more intrigue and emotion to achieve the desired length while maintaining an engaging and simple narrative style. Underscore 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 on. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The bustling activity of the campus, the whispers of the crowd, and even the sharp breeze rustling through the trees felt muted. All eyes were locked on that golden medal glinting in the sunlight. James didn't speak immediately. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. Slowly, he adjusted the satchel and gently tucked the medal out of sight. His movements were calm, deliberate, but there was no mistaking the slight tension in his posture. Officer Daniels, however, wasn't ready to let it go. His curiosity, now mixed with confusion and an edge of suspicion, drove him to press further. "What is that?" he demanded, gesturing toward the medal. His voice carried a mix of authority and doubt, as though he wasn't entirely sure what he'd just seen. James met his gaze evenly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It's a medal," he replied simply. "A medal?" Daniels repeated, his tone skeptical. "What kind of medal?" The crowd around them grew restless. A few students exchanged glances, their curiosity morphing into excitement. They had seen enough viral videos to recognize when a moment was about to become memorable. Phones were now aimed squarely at the unfolding scene, ready to capture every word, every expression. James hesitated, not out of fear or guilt but because he knew what was coming. He had always been a man who valued privacy, who preferred his work to speak for itself rather than standing in the spotlight. But here, in this charged moment, he realized there was no avoiding it. With a quiet sigh, he reached into his bag and carefully pulled out the medal. The sunlight caught its surface, making it shine like a beacon. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Daniels took a step back, his eyes widening. "This," James said, holding the medal up for all to see, "is a Nobel Prize. I was awarded it for my contributions to quantum physics." His voice was steady, but there was a subtle edge to it now, a quiet assertion of his worth. The crowd erupted. Students began murmuring loudly, some in awe, others in disbelief. A few even cheered, clapping and calling out James's name as though he were a rock star. The shift in energy was palpable, the weight of the moment sinking in for everyone present. Daniels, on the other hand, looked visibly shaken. The certainty with which he had approached James only moments ago had dissolved, replaced by an awkward mix of embarrassment and unease. He opened his mouth to speak but found himself at a loss for words. James took a step closer, his expression calm but firm. "Officer," he said, his tone measured, "I understand you're here to do your job. But perhaps next time, you might consider asking questions before jumping to conclusions." The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers laced with approval. Daniel stiffened, his face reddening slightly, but he nodded curtly. I was just following up on a report," he said defensively, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. James didn't respond right away. He simply slipped the medal back into his bag and adjusted the strap over his shoulder. Then, with a polite nod to the officer, he turned and walked away, his steps measured and unhurried. The crowd parted to let him pass, their eyes filled with a mix of admiration and curiosity. As James made his way toward the faculty building, the buzz of conversation followed him. Students speculated about what had just happened, some searching online for confirmation of his Nobel Prize win, others replaying the videos they had just recorded. For James, the moment was both validating and uncomfortable. He had spent years trying to avoid this kind of attention, choosing instead to focus on his teaching and research. But now, it seemed, his quiet existence had been upended in the span of a few minutes. As he walked through the quiet corridors of the faculty building, James couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The medal in his bag wasn't just a symbol of recognition, it was a testament to decades of hard work, sleepless nights, and unwavering determination. He had grown up in a small, working-class town where opportunities were scarce, and dreams often felt like luxuries. But even as a child, James had been different. While other kids played in the streets, he spent hours poring over library books, fascinated by the mysteries of the universe. His teachers had recognized his potential early on, encouraging him to pursue his passion for science. Despite the odds, James had excelled. He earned scholarships, worked part-time jobs, and fought his way into the best universities. Along the way, he encountered challenges that would have broken many: financial struggles, personal losses, and countless rejections from institutions that failed to see his worth. But James was relentless. He knew that his work had the potential to change lives, to solve problems that others deemed unsolvable. His groundbreaking research on quantum mechanics had opened new doors in science, leading to advancements in technology, medicine, and energy. When the Nobel Committee announced his name, James had been stunned. The recognition was overwhelming, a validation of everything he had fought for. But even then, he had chosen to keep the spotlight at arm's length. For him, the greatest reward was the knowledge that his work had made a difference. Back in his office, James set his bag down and leaned back in his chair. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, his mind racing with thoughts about what had just happened. He knew the videos would spread quickly, that by the end of the day, most of the campus and perhaps even the world would know his name. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, that his contributions to science were more important than any title or award. But now, he realized that sometimes, recognition wasn't just about personal validation. It was about showing others what was possible, about inspiring the next generation to dream bigger and reach higher. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He looked up to see a group of students standing hesitantly in the doorway, their expressions a mix of excitement and awe. "Professor Harrington," one of them began, "we just wanted to say, we had no idea. About the Nobel Prize, I mean. That's incredible." James smiled, gesturing for them to come in. "Thank you," he said simply. "But you know, the prize doesn't change who I am. I'm still your professor, and my job is to help you learn and grow." The students nodded, their admiration evident. One of them hesitated before asking, "But, why didn't you tell anyone? I mean, that's such a big deal." James leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Because it's not about the prize," he explained. "It's about the work. The prize is just a symbol. What really matters is what we do with the knowledge we have. That's what I want all of you to remember." The students exchanged glances, clearly moved by his words. As they left, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had always believed in leading by example, in showing rather than telling. And now, more than ever, he realized the impact his story could have not just on his students, but on anyone who heard it. The trouble began with the arrival of Officer Daniels, a man whose presence alone could shift the mood of any space. He wasn't a stranger to the community, but his reputation preceded him, a no-nonsense enforcer with a quick temper and a tendency to jump to conclusions. When Daniels walked onto campus that day, his sharp eyes scanning the lively quad, a quiet tension seemed to follow him. He had been sent to investigate an ambiguous call about a suspicious individual on the grounds. The details were vague: a man acting oddly, possibly carrying something concerning. Daniels, however, didn't need much to go on. He had a knack for finding trouble or creating it when necessary. As Daniels strode through the cobblestone paths, his heavy boots thudding against the ground, students began to notice him. His imposing figure, clad in a crisp uniform with a holstered weapon, contrasted sharply with the relaxed atmosphere of the campus. Conversations faltered, and heads turned, curiosity sparking among the groups of students scattered across the quad. It was near the faculty lounge where Daniels first spotted James Harrington. The professor was leaning against the wall, reviewing a set of notes with his signature focus. He was oblivious to the officer's approach, his mind occupied with thoughts of his next lecture. But Daniels wasn't one for subtleties. He zeroed in on James immediately, something about the man's calm demeanor and worn satchel catching his attention. "Hey! You there?" Daniels barked, his voice cutting through the low hum of campus chatter. James looked up, startled but composed. He straightened and adjusted his glasses, his expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. "Yes, officer," he replied, his tone polite. "Can I help you?" Daniels marched toward him, his scowl deepening with every step. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his hand resting on his belt in a way that seemed more authoritative than necessary. James tilted his head slightly, still unsure of the officer's intent. "I work here," he said simply, holding up the stack of papers as if to emphasize the point. "I'm a professor. Is something wrong?" But Daniels wasn't in the mood for explanations. To him, James didn't look the part of a professor. His jacket was too worn, his satchel too ordinary. Combined with the vague description from the earlier call, Daniels had already made up his mind. "Don't act clueless," Daniels snapped, his tone sharp. "We've had complaints about someone matching your description. You need to come with me." A small group of students nearby froze, their conversations halting as they turned their attention to the exchange. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. "What's going on?" one student asked, pulling out their phone to record. Another frowned, muttering, "Is that Professor Harrington? Why is the cop yelling at him?" James's calm demeanor didn't falter, though a flicker of discomfort crossed his face. He had spent years handling high-pressure situations in the scientific world, but this was different. The weight of judgment in Danielle's tone and the growing eyes of the students made it impossible to ignore the tension building around him. "Officer," James said evenly, keeping his voice measured. "I assure you, I'm just here to do my job. If there's been a misunderstanding, perhaps we can clear it up." But Daniels wasn't interested in reasoning. To him, James's composed response only deepened his suspicion. "We'll clear it up at the station," he shot back. "Let's go." The small crowd began to grow, students stepping closer to catch what was happening. Phones were now aimed squarely at the pair, their cameras capturing every word, every movement. The murmurs grew louder, tinged with disbelief. "Why is he being questioned?" "That's Dr. Harrington," one student whispered. "He's, like, the smartest guy on campus." James remained rooted in place, his posture calm but firm. "Officer," he said again, his voice slightly firmer this time. "I'm not sure why you're singling me out, but I don't see a reason to go anywhere with you. I've done nothing wrong." Daniel's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, taking a step closer. At that moment, the air seemed to thicken, charged with the unspoken tension of authority clashing with quiet defiance. The students watching held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. James met the officer's gaze steadily, his voice unwavering as he said, "I'm happy to cooperate, but only if you tell me what I've done to warrant this attention." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice from the crowd called out, "Leave him alone. That's Dr. Harrington, you're making a mistake." The officer turned sharply, his glare landing on the student who had spoken. The interruption only seemed to agitate him further. "Stay out of this," Daniels barked, his tone harsher than before. But the crowd wasn't backing down. The murmurs turned into louder protests, more students voicing their confusion and concern. "Why are you harassing him?" one shouted. "He's literally a professor here." The officer's face reddened slightly, the weight of the crowd's scrutiny beginning to press down on him. Still, he turned back to James, doubling down. "I don't care who you are," he said coldly. "You're coming with me." James stood his ground, his calm exterior hiding the simmering frustration beneath. He had spent his entire career avoiding conflict, focusing instead on solving the world's problems through reason and intellect. But here he was, being treated like a criminal for simply existing in a space he had every right to be in. The crowd continued to grow, the students' energy shifting from passive curiosity to active indignation. Some called out in defense of James, while others recorded every second, their phones capturing what was quickly becoming a spectacle. "Dr. Harrington doesn't deserve this," one student shouted. "Do you even know who he is?" But Daniels wasn't listening. His focus remained locked on James, the quiet man whose calm refusal to comply was starting to unravel the officer's composure. "I'm giving you one last chance," Daniels said through gritted teeth. "Don't make me force you." James took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. He could see the concern on his students' faces, the way they looked at him as though he were their anchor in the storm. Turning back to Daniels, he spoke with quiet authority. "I won't resist, officer," he said, his voice steady. "But I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing. There are consequences to actions like these." The statement hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daniels faltered for a brief moment, the weight of James's words cutting through his frustration. but before he could respond, a student near the front stepped forward, holding up their phone. "Look him up," the student said boldly. "Google his name. Dr. James Harrington. You'll see exactly why you're making a mistake." Daniels hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And as the officer stared at James, the unassuming professor who had become the center of attention, the students knew they were witnessing a moment they wouldn't soon forget. Daniels's hesitation didn't last long. His pride was on the line, and he wasn't about to back down in front of an increasingly vocal crowd. His hand moved to the radio clip to his shoulder, and he muttered something into it, his eyes still locked on James. James stood his ground, his expression calm but resolute. Inside, however, he felt a flicker of frustration. The students' whispers, the phones aimed at him, the officer's unwavering glare, it was all too much. This wasn't how his quiet day was supposed to go. One student, a young woman with a determined expression, took a step forward. She wasn't holding a phone like the others. Instead, her voice rang out clearly. "Officer, you're making a mistake," she said. "Dr. Harrington is one of the most respected professors here. He's a Nobel Prize winner." The crowd went silent for a moment, the words hanging in the air. A ripple of murmurs followed, disbelief and excitement spreading among the students. Daniels blinked, his brow furrowing. "A Nobel Prize winner?" he repeated skeptically, his tone laced with disbelief. He glanced back at James, scanning him again as if seeing him for the first time. The old tweed jacket, the worn satchel, the unassuming demeanor, it didn't fit. "That's right," another student chimed in, emboldened by the first. "Look it up if you don't believe us. Dr. Harrington is a genius. He's been on campus for years." James shifted uncomfortably, wishing the students hadn't said anything. The Nobel Prize had never been something he flaunted. He valued his privacy, preferred his work to speak for itself. Now, his quiet reputation was becoming a spectacle. Daniels, however, wasn't convinced. He crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing. "I don't care what awards he's won," he snapped. "There was a report, and I'm here to investigate. Nobody's above the law." The crowd bristled at his words, murmurs of protest bubbling up again. "He didn't do anything." One student shouted. "Why are you harassing him?" Another student, standing near the front, pointed out, "This is profiling. You're targeting him because he doesn't look like what you think a professor should be." Daniels's face reddened, his frustration evident. He turned back to James, his voice tight with authority. "I'm going to ask you one last time. Come with me, or I'll have to take you in." James sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He glanced at the students, their faces a mixture of anger and concern. They were looking to him, waiting to see what he would do. "Officer," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I've told you who I am, and I've done nothing wrong. I suggest you reconsider your approach before this escalates further." Daniels bristled at the response, his pride stung by James's quiet defiance. The officer stepped closer, his posture rigid. "Are you resisting?" he asked, his tone dangerously low. Before James could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Stop." All heads turned to see an older woman hurrying toward the scene. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and her sharp, no-nonsense expression marked her as someone of authority. It was Dean Parker, the head of the university's faculty. "Officer Daniels," she said briskly, stepping between him and James. "What is the meaning of this?" Daniels hesitated, thrown off by her sudden appearance. "There was a report," he began, his tone defensive. "A suspicious individual on campus." Dean Parker held up a hand, silencing him. "And you decided that individual was Dr. Harrington?" One of our most respected professors. Her voice was icy, each word carrying a weight that made Daniels falter. I was just doing my job, Daniels muttered, his confidence visibly shaken. Your job, Dean Parker repeated, her tone sharp, is to protect and serve this community. Not to harass innocent members of our faculty. She turned to James, her expression softening. Are you all right, Dr. Harrington? James nodded, offering her a small smile. I'm fine, Dean. Thank you for stepping in. Dean Parker turned back to Daniels, her eyes narrowing. I suggest you leave this campus immediately, officer. Your actions here today are not only inappropriate but unacceptable. If you have a legitimate reason to question Dr. Harrington, you can do so through the proper channels. The crowd erupted in applause, the students